Billionaire held his newborn in the hospital, but never expected his ex-fiancée to come meet the baby. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The sterile, fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Maverick Keene's angular face as he cradled the tiny bundle in his arms. At 37, he commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals with unwavering confidence, but this 7-pound miracle reduced him to trembling uncertainty. The baby's delicate features were serene in sleep, tiny fingers curled against a blanket that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Maverick's dark hair was disheveled, his usually pristine Armani suit wrinkled from hours of pacing hospital corridors. His steel-gray eyes, typically sharp with business acumen, now held a vulnerability he'd never allowed anyone to witness. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his broad shoulders, heavier than any corporate merger he'd ever navigated. "Your mommy is fighting for her life," he whispered to the sleeping infant, his voice cracking with exhaustion and guilt. "And I'm the reason you're here, aren't I?" The private room was filled with expensive arrangements of white lilies and roses, flowers he'd ordered more out of obligation than sentiment. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below them, its lights twinkling like stars in the darkness. This was supposed to be his kingdom, his empire built on renewable energy innovations that would change the world. Instead, it felt like a monument to his failures. His mind drifted to that fateful night 8 months ago. The company's annual gala had been a resounding success. Another renewable energy contract worth hundreds of millions. The champagne had flowed freely, and he'd been celebrating not just business triumph, but his engagement to Annelle Durand, the brilliant environmental engineer who'd stolen his heart with her passion for sustainable technology and her infectious laugh. But Scarlett Morrison had been there too, the marketing director with auburn hair and emerald eyes who'd been dropping hints for months. When Annelle left early with a headache, Scarlett had swooped in with congratulations and more champagne. Too much champagne. One moment of weakness. One night that shattered everything. Maverick's jaw clenched as he remembered Annelle's face when she'd confronted him a month later. Not about the affair. He'd confessed that immediately, drowning in guilt. But about Scarlett's pregnancy. The way Annelle's hazel eyes had filled with tears before turning cold as winter steel. The way she'd slipped off her engagement ring, a 3-carat diamond he'd had custom designed, and placed it on his desk with trembling fingers. "I can't do this, Maverick," she'd whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I could forgive the mistake, but a baby? That's not just a moment of weakness. That's a lifetime consequence." He'd begged, pleaded, offered to pay for anything Scarlett needed while maintaining distance. But Annelle had shaken her head, her golden brown hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through his office windows. "You made your choice that night. Now, I'm making mine." The baby stirred in his arms, making soft mewing sounds that tugged at something deep in Maverick's chest. He'd kept his distance throughout Scarlett's pregnancy, providing the best medical care money could buy while struggling with resentment and regret. He'd convinced himself he was doing his duty, nothing more. But holding his son now, because yes, it was a boy, with Maverick's dark hair and what looked like his mother's delicate nose, everything felt different, terrifying and overwhelming, but different. "Sir?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Maverick looked up to see Dr. Patricia Williams, the lead obstetrician, standing in the doorway. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he could read the concern in her brown eyes. "How is she?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Stable for now. The hemorrhaging has stopped, but she's still unconscious. Her body went through significant trauma during the delivery. We're monitoring her closely." Maverick nodded, guilt gnawing at his insides. Scarlett was fighting for her life because of a child he'd never wanted, conceived during a night he'd give anything to undo. "The baby needs a name for the birth certificate," Dr. Williams continued gently. A name. Something so simple, yet so permanent. Maverick looked down at his son, studying the peaceful expression, the way the infant's chest rose and fell with each tiny breath. "Alexander," he said finally. "Alexander James Keene." Dr. Williams made a note on her tablet. "And have you thought about arrangements? If Ms. Morrison's condition doesn't improve, you'll need to consider care options for Alexander." The weight of that possibility pressed down on Maverick like a physical force. Scarlett might not survive. He could be a single father to a child he'd never planned for. raising a constant reminder of the night he'd destroyed his future with the only woman he'd ever loved. As Dr. Williams left, Maverick sank into the leather recliner beside the window, Alexander still secure in his arms. The baby's presence was both a comfort and a torment, innocent and beautiful, but born from betrayal and regret. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to imagine just for a moment what it would have been like if things had been different, if he'd been stronger that night, if he'd gone home to Annelle instead of drowning his success in champagne and poor decisions. If this baby had been theirs, planned and wanted and celebrated. The sound of heels clicking against polished hospital floors drew him from his thoughts. Probably another nurse checking vitals or Dr. Williams with updates. He didn't bother looking up until the footsteps stopped just outside his door. When he raised his head, his world tilted on its axis. Annelle stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame as if she needed support. At 29, she was just as beautiful as he remembered, perhaps more so. Her honey blonde hair was shorter now, cut in a sleek bob that framed her heart-shaped face. She wore a simple navy dress that hugged her slender figure and low heels that made her look professional yet approachable. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. Those hazel eyes that had once looked at him with such love now held a complex mixture of pain, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Hello, Maverick," she said softly, her voice carrying the same melodic quality that had first captivated him 3 years ago. He struggled to find words, his throat suddenly dry. "Annelle, what are you doing here?" She stepped into the room, her gaze moving from his face to the baby in his arms. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a vulnerability that made his chest ache. "I came to see him," she said simply. "Your son. What drove you here tonight, Annelle? Was it closure, curiosity, or something deeper that brought you back to the man who broke your heart?" For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. The only sounds in the room were the soft hum of medical equipment from down the hall and Alexander's gentle breathing. Maverick felt as though he were drowning, caught between the weight of his past mistakes and the impossibility of Annelle's presence. She looked different, stronger somehow, as if the pain of their breakup had forged her into something more resilient. The vulnerability he'd once known so well was still there, but it was tempered now with a quiet strength that made his chest tighten with both admiration and regret. "How did you know?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Annelle's gaze remained fixed on Alexander, and Maverick watched as her expression softened further. "Dr. Williams called me. Apparently Scarlett listed me as an emergency contact months ago." She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "I think she knew this day might come, and she wanted someone here who might care about what happens to him." The revelation hit Maverick like a physical blow. Scarlett, lying unconscious in the ICU, had thought of Annelle even while fighting for her own life. The woman he'd betrayed had somehow become a contingency plan for the child born from his infidelity. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "For all of it. For that night, for what it cost us, for—" "Don't." Annelle held up a hand, her voice firm but not unkind. "We're not here for apologies, Maverick. We're here for him." She moved closer and Maverick caught the familiar scent of her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of spring mornings and lazy Sundays spent in bed, planning their future. The memory was so vivid it took his breath away. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward Alexander. Maverick hesitated for only a moment before carefully transferring his son into Annelle's arms. The sight of her holding his child should have felt wrong, twisted somehow by the circumstances. Instead, it felt achingly right, as if this was how things were always meant to be. Annelle settled into the chair beside his, cradling Alexander with practiced ease. "He's beautiful," she murmured, tracing a finger along the baby's cheek. "He looks like you, but softer somehow, more peaceful than you ever managed to look." Despite everything, Maverick found himself almost smiling at her gentle teasing. "I've had a lot on my mind lately." "I imagine you have." She looked up at him, and for a moment, the walls between them seemed to thin. "Have you seen her, Scarlett?" His jaw tightened. "Briefly, before the surgery. She was scared, asking me to promise that Alexander would be okay if something happened to her." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know how to be what he needs, Annelle. I never wanted this. But he's here now," she said simply. "And wanting him or not wanting him doesn't change the fact that he needs you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both watching Alexander sleep. Outside, the city continued its restless movement. But in this room, time seemed suspended. Maverick found himself studying Annelle's profile, noting the subtle changes 8 months had brought. There were tiny lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, evidence of sleepless nights and tears he'd caused. "How have you been?" he asked softly. A shadow crossed her face. "Surviving. Working. I took the position with the environmental consulting firm in Portland. It's good work. Meaningful work. Portland, 3,000 miles away." The distance felt insurmountable even though they were sitting less than 2 feet apart. "I heard about the hydroelectric project," he said. "The one along the Columbia River. Your design is revolutionary." Annelle's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "You've been keeping tabs on me?" "I never stopped caring about your success," he admitted. Just because I destroyed what we had doesn't mean I stopped believing in what you could accomplish." Something flickered in her eyes. Pain, maybe, or recognition of the man she'd once planned to marry. "It's been good for me being away, challenging myself in new ways, building something that's entirely mine." The words stung, though he knew he deserved them. She'd had to rebuild her entire life because of his choices, create a new identity separate from the future they'd planned together. Alexander stirred in Annelle's arms, making soft sounds that seemed to fill the room with warmth. She automatically began to rock him gently, humming under her breath, a lullaby he didn't recognize but that sounded hauntingly beautiful in her clear soprano voice. "You're a natural at this," he observed. "I always wanted children," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "We talked about it so many times. 2 kids, maybe 3. A house with a big backyard and a garden where we could teach them about sustainability and growing their own food." The future they'd planned together hung between them like a ghost. Maverick remembered those conversations. Lazy evening talks about baby names and school districts, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. They'd even looked at houses in the suburbs, imagining their life beyond his Manhattan penthouse. "I remember," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember all of it." Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway again, her expression more optimistic than before. "Mr. Keene, I have good news. Ms. Morrison is conscious and asking for you. Her vitals are stabilizing." Relief flooded through Maverick, followed immediately by a complex tangle of emotions he couldn't untangle. Scarlett was going to be okay, which meant Alexander would have his mother, but it also meant the woman he'd betrayed Annelle with would soon be awake, aware, and part of their lives in a way that would make any reconciliation impossible. He looked at Annelle, who was carefully transferring Alexander back into his arms. Her face had closed off again, the brief intimacy of the last hour dissolving like morning mist. "Go," she said softly. "She needs to see that he's safe." "Will you?" he began, then stopped, not sure what he was asking. "I'll be here when you get back," she said, settling back into her chair. Someone should stay with him. As Maverick made his way to the ICU, Alexander secure in his arms, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change again. Scarlett's recovery was a blessing, but it would also force decisions he wasn't ready to make. How could he be a father to Alexander while navigating his complicated relationship with Scarlett? And what did Annelle's presence here mean for all of them? The answers felt as fragile and uncertain as the tiny life in his arms, and just as precious. The ICU was a maze of beeping monitors and hushed conversations, where life and death decisions were made in sterile rooms behind sliding glass doors. Maverick moved through the corridors with Alexander still in his arms, drawing curious glances from nurses who weren't accustomed to seeing newborns in this part of the hospital. Scarlett's room was at the end of the hall, and through the glass partition he could see her propped up against white pillows, her auburn hair fanned across the pillowcase like spilled wine. Even after everything she'd been through, she was undeniably beautiful. The kind of striking beauty that had caught his attention that fateful night when his defenses were down and his judgment clouded by champagne and success. He paused outside her door, studying her through the glass. Her emerald eyes were closed, but her breathing was steady, and the color had returned to her cheeks. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than the confident marketing director who had pursued him with such determination. Taking a deep breath, Maverick pushed open the door and stepped inside. Scarlett's eyes fluttered open at the sound, and when she saw him holding Alexander, her face transformed with a mixture of relief, joy, and something that might have been regret. "Maverick," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd recently removed. Is he okay?" "He's perfect," Maverick said, moving closer to her bedside. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Alexander James. Tears filled Scarlett's eyes as she reached out with trembling fingers to touch their son's hand. Alexander, she repeated softly. It's a strong name. A good name. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking down at the baby who had changed everything between them. Maverick felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, along with a confusion of emotions he couldn't quite sort through. I was so scared, Scarlett admitted, her voice barely audible. During the delivery, when everything started going wrong, I thought I might not see him, that I might not get to hold him. But you're here, Maverick said, though his tone lacked the warmth such a moment should have carried. You're both here, and you're both going to be fine. Scarlett's gaze lifted to his face, and he saw a flicker of the awareness that had always existed between them, the recognition of their complicated situation. I know this isn't what you wanted, Maverick. Any of this. He wanted to deny it, to offer some comfort or reassurance, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too stark, too painful for both of them. Alexander had been conceived in a moment of weakness and poor judgment, born into a world where his parents shared nothing but regret and obligation. What I wanted doesn't matter now, he said finally. What matters is what's best for him. And what's best for him? Scarlett asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be complicated. Before Maverick could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Williams entered, followed by someone Maverick hadn't expected to see. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a family counselor the hospital provided for complicated situations like theirs. Ms. Morrison, I'm glad to see you're doing better, Dr. Williams said with a warm smile. Your recovery has been remarkable. Dr. Martinez is here to discuss some important matters regarding Alexander's care and your discharge plans. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a professional bun. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated countless family crises. I understand this is a delicate situation, Dr. Martinez began, settling into the chair beside Scarlett's bed. From what I've been told, you two aren't in a romantic relationship, but you're now co-parents to Alexander. We need to discuss practical arrangements for his care, especially given Ms. Morrison's recovery needs. Scarlett struggled to sit up straighter, wincing slightly from the movement. I want to take care of him myself. I know the situation is unconventional, but he's my son. Of course he is, Dr. Martinez said gently. But you'll need significant recovery time before you can handle the physical demands of caring for a newborn alone. Do you have family support? A place to stay where you won't be alone? A shadow crossed Scarlett's face. My parents they're not supportive of my choices. They made that clear when I told them about the pregnancy. And my sister lives in California. Maverick felt a stab of guilt. He'd been so focused on his own pain and loss that he hadn't fully considered how isolated Scarlett had been throughout her pregnancy. She'd been carrying his child while dealing with family disapproval and social judgment, all while he'd maintained his distance and nursed his own wounds. I have resources, he said suddenly. I can arrange for private nursing care, a comfortable place for recovery, whatever you need. Scarlett's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed born of gratitude rather than pain. You don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted, his voice firmer now. Alexander is my responsibility too. That means making sure his mother has everything she needs to recover and care for him. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's a very mature approach, Mr. Keene. However, I should mention that there's been an unusual development. Ms. Morrison, you listed an Annelle Durand as an emergency contact. She's currently in the maternity ward with Alexander. Scarlett's eyes widened in surprise. Annelle came? I wasn't sure she would. You know about Annelle? Maverick asked, confusion evident in his voice. A flush crept up Scarlett's neck and she couldn't meet his eyes. I knew about your engagement when that night happened. I knew I was breaking up something important to you. I researched her afterward, felt guilty about what I'd done. She seemed like a good person, the kind of person who might care about an innocent child, even if she couldn't forgive the adults who created the situation. The admission hit Maverick like a physical blow. Scarlett had known about Annelle all along, had deliberately pursued him despite knowing he was engaged. The betrayal felt fresh and raw, compounding his guilt and confusion. Why? He asked, his voice tight with emotion. Why would you do that? Why would you pursue someone you knew was committed to someone else? Scarlett's tears flowed freely now. Because I was in love with you, she whispered. I'd been in love with you for months, watching you with her, knowing I could never compete with what you two had. That night, When she left early and you were celebrating, I thought maybe, just for one night, I could have what I'd been dreaming about. The raw honesty of her confession left Maverick speechless. Here was the truth he'd been avoiding, that what happened between them hadn't been meaningless physical attraction fueled by alcohol. For Scarlett, it had been about love, however misguided and destructive. I know it was wrong, she continued, her voice breaking. I know I destroyed something beautiful between you and Annelle, but I can't regret it completely, because it gave me Alexander. And maybe having her here means she doesn't hate him for how he came to be. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat gently. This is exactly why family counseling is so important in situations like this. There are deep emotional wounds that need to be addressed, not just practical arrangements. Mr. Keene, how do you feel about Ms. Duran's presence here? Maverick looked down at Alexander, who had been sleeping peacefully through the entire conversation. His son was innocent in all of this, a pure soul born into a complicated web of adult mistakes and emotions. I don't know, he admitted. Seeing her again, it brings back everything I lost. But watching her with Alexander, seeing how naturally she cares for him, it also makes me remember why I fell in love with her in the first place. The machines monitoring Scarlett's vital signs beeped steadily in the silence that followed, a mechanical reminder that life continued even when the heart was breaking. When Maverick returned to the maternity ward, he found Annelle standing by the window, silhouetted against the city lights. She had changed Alexander's diaper and swaddled him expertly in a fresh blanket, and the baby was now sleeping peacefully in the hospital bassinet. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that it made Maverick's chest ache with longing for what might have been. How is she? Annelle asked without turning around, her voice carefully neutral. Recovering. The doctors say she'll be able to go home in a few days. Maverick moved to stand beside her at the window, careful to maintain some distance. She knew about you, Annelle. She knew about our engagement when we... Annelle's reflection in the window showed a tightening around her eyes. I suspected as much. Women have intuition about these things. Does that make it worse? Knowing it wasn't just a random mistake but something more calculated? It makes it different, she said quietly, but not necessarily worse. At least now I understand why she listed me as Alexander's emergency contact. Guilt is a powerful motivator. They stood in silence for a moment, both watching the city below. Maverick could see his reflection alongside hers in the glass. Two people who had once been inseparable, now separated by invisible barriers of hurt and betrayal. Dr. Martinez wants to schedule family counseling sessions, he said, to help us navigate the complexities of co-parenting. Us? Annelle turned to face him fully, her hazel eyes sharp with surprise. Maverick, I'm not part of this family. I'm just someone who happened to be here tonight. But you came, he said, stepping closer. When you got that call, you could have ignored it. You could have stayed in Portland and let me handle this alone. But you came. I came for him, she said firmly, gesturing toward Alexander. For an innocent child who didn't ask to be born into this mess. That doesn't mean I'm ready to play house with you and with Scarlett. The way she stumbled over referring to Scarlett spoke volumes about the pain she was still carrying. Maverick wanted to reach for her, to touch her face the way he used to when she was upset, but he kept his hands at his sides. What if I told you I'm still in love with you? He asked suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. What if I told you that every day for the past 8 months has been hell without you? Annelle's breath caught, and for a moment her carefully constructed walls wavered. I'd say that love isn't enough, Maverick. Trust is the foundation of everything, and you shattered that, not just with one night of poor judgment, but with the consequences that followed. Every time I look at Alexander, I'll remember why we're not together. He's innocent in all of this, Maverick said desperately. He didn't choose to be born from my mistakes. No, he didn't, she agreed, her voice softening as she looked at the sleeping baby. And that's exactly why this is so complicated. I could fall in love with him, Maverick. I could love that little boy as if he were my own. But what happens when Scarlett decides she doesn't want me in his life? What happens when she wants to play happy family with you? Scarlett and I aren't together, he said quickly. What happened between us was a mistake, not the beginning of a relationship. But you're connected now, forever, through him. Annelle's voice was thick with emotion. You'll share holidays and birthdays and school events. You'll make decisions together about his upbringing, his education, his future. And I'll be what? The woman who almost became his stepmother? Before Maverick could respond, the door opened, and a young nurse entered, her scrubs decorated with cartoon animals. She looked exhausted but maintained a professional smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but Alexander needs his next feeding, and we need to discuss his discharge paperwork. Is one of you planning to take him home when Ms. Morrison is released?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maverick realized he hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered the practical reality of taking care of a newborn when he'd spent the last 8 months emotionally distancing himself from the pregnancy. He began, then stopped, uncertainty clouding his features. Annelle stepped forward, her expression shifting into the take charge mode he remembered so well from their time together. "What kind of support does Ms. Morrison have at home? Any family nearby?" "Her emergency contact forms indicate she doesn't have local family support," the nurse said carefully. "Mr. Keene, have you discussed living arrangements with Ms. Morrison?" Maverick felt the weight of responsibility settling heavier on his shoulders. "I told her I'd arrange for private nursing care, somewhere comfortable for her to recover." "That's generous," the nurse said, "but newborns need consistent caregivers who can bond with them. The first few months are crucial for attachment and development." Annelle was quiet for a long moment, studying Alexander with an expression Maverick couldn't read. When she spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "What if," she began, then paused, seeming to wrestle with herself. "What if Scarlett and Alexander stayed in my apartment in Portland for a few weeks, just until she's fully recovered? I have a spare room, and I work mostly from home right now. I could help with the transition while she learns to care for him." Maverick stared at her in shock. "Annelle, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted. "But maybe I want to. Maybe I need to do this for my own peace of mind. To know that Alexander is safe and cared for regardless of how complicated things are between us." The nurse looked relieved. "That sounds like a wonderful solution if everyone agrees. New mothers often do better with support, especially after traumatic deliveries." But Maverick felt a new kind of anxiety building in his chest. The thought of Annelle caring for his son, bonding with Alexander while helping Scarlett recover, was both incredibly generous and potentially heartbreaking for everyone involved. "What about your job?" he asked. "The hydroelectric project?" "I can work remotely for a few weeks," she said simply. "The preliminary design phase is mostly computer modeling anyway." As if sensing the tension in the room, Alexander began to stir in his bassinet, making soft sounds that would soon escalate to hungry cries. Without hesitation, Annelle moved to prepare his bottle, her movements confident and natural. Watching her care for his son, Maverick felt a dangerous hope beginning to bloom in his chest. But hope, he'd learned, could be the most devastating emotion of all. 3 days later, Maverick found himself in the most surreal situation of his life, sitting in the first-class cabin of a private jet bound for Portland, watching his ex-fiancée bottle feed the son he'd had with another woman. Scarlett dozed in the seat across the aisle, still weak from her ordeal but determined to be discharged from the hospital despite her doctor's concerns. The jet was one of his smaller aircraft, configured for comfort rather than business meetings. Soft leather seats, mahogany trim, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the clouds below. It was the same plane he and Annelle had taken to Napa Valley for their second anniversary, when he'd first started thinking about engagement rings and forever. "He's getting stronger," Annelle murmured, adjusting Alexander's position as he fed. "His grip is more confident now." Maverick watched her with a mixture of awe and agony. She'd taken to motherhood with an intuitive grace that made everything look effortless, but he could see the emotional toll in the careful way she held herself, the deliberate distance she maintained from him even in the confined space of the aircraft. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Scarlett. "I could hire the best nannies, arrange for round-the-clock care in Manhattan. You don't have to disrupt your life for us." "For him," Annelle corrected, not looking up from Alexander. "I'm doing this for him and maybe for me too. I need to know that I can handle being around this situation without falling apart." There was steel in her voice that hadn't been there before their breakup. The past 8 months had changed her, made her more self-sufficient and guarded. Maverick missed the softness she'd once shown only to him, the vulnerability she'd trusted him with. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, Rebecca, updating him on the arrangements she'd made in Portland. A private nurse would be available if needed, a grocery delivery service was stocked and ready, and his security team had already swept Annelle's building for any potential issues. "I've arranged for additional support," he said, showing her the message. "Whatever you need, just say the word." "What I need," Annelle said, finally meeting his eyes, "is for you to understand that this is temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month, until Scarlett is strong enough to manage on her own. Then you'll need to figure out a permanent arrangement that doesn't involve me." The word stung, but he nodded his acceptance. I understand. Do you? She challenged, her voice sharper than before. Because you're looking at me the way you used to, Maverick. Like you're hoping this proximity will somehow fix what's broken between us. That's not what this is. Before he could respond, Scarlett stirred in her seat, her green eyes opening slowly. She looked pale and fragile, but alert. Are we almost there? About 20 minutes out, Maverick replied, immediately shifting his attention to her. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, she said honestly, attempting a weak smile. But better than yesterday. Her gaze moved to Annelle holding Alexander, and something complex flickered across her features. I still can't believe you're doing this. Helping us, I mean. After everything. Annelle's expression softened slightly. Children shouldn't suffer for adult mistakes. Alexander deserves the best possible start in life, regardless of how complicated his family situation is. His family situation? Scarlett repeated slowly. I suppose that's what we are now, isn't it? A family. Just not the conventional kind. Maverick felt the weight of that word. Family. He'd once thought he knew what his family would look like. Him and Annelle, maybe 2 children with her eyes and his determination, Sunday brunches and vacation photos, and a love that could weather any storm. Instead, he had a son with a woman he barely knew, while the woman he'd planned to marry sat nearby, treating them all with careful, professional kindness. Annelle, Scarlett said suddenly, can I ask you something personal? Annelle tensed slightly but nodded. Of course. Do you hate me? For what I did? I would understand if you did. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maverick held his breath, realizing he desperately wanted to hear the answer too. Annelle was quiet for a long moment, studying Scarlett's face. I did, for a while, she said finally. I hated you for knowing about me and pursuing him anyway. I hated you for getting pregnant and making it impossible for me to pretend that night didn't matter. But mostly I hated myself for not being enough to keep him faithful. Annelle, Maverick started, but she held up a hand. But hate is exhausting, she continued, her focus still on Scarlett, and it's not productive. What's done is done. The question now is how we move forward in a way that's healthy for Alexander. Scarlett's eyes filled with tears. I was so jealous of what you two had. Everyone at the company knew how much he loved you, how you'd changed him. He used to be all business all the time, but with you he laughed more, took time off, talked about actual dreams instead of just quarterly projections. Maverick's throat tightened. He'd forgotten how much he'd changed during his time with Annelle, how she'd made him want to be more than just a successful businessman. She'd made him want to be a better person. That night, Scarlett continued, her voice barely audible over the aircraft engines, when I approached him at the party, he was so sad. He kept saying you'd been distant lately, working too much, that he was worried he was losing you to your career ambitions. I told him what he wanted to hear, that any woman would be lucky to have him, that you didn't appreciate what you had. Annelle's grip on Alexander tightened slightly, and Maverick saw her jaw clench. Is that supposed to make me feel better, knowing you manipulated his insecurities? No, Scarlett said quickly. It's supposed to make you understand that he never stopped loving you. Even in that moment, even drunk and vulnerable, he was talking about you, about how to win you back, how to prove he could be the man you deserved. The cabin fell silent, except for the steady hum of engines and Alexander's contented breathing. Maverick felt exposed, as if Scarlett had stripped away all his defenses and left his heart raw and bleeding for both women to see. The truth is, Scarlett said, looking directly at Maverick now, I think I always knew that one night was all I'd ever have with you, but I was selfish enough to take it anyway, even knowing it would destroy everything good in your life. As the plane began its descent into Portland, Maverick realized that the next few weeks would be either a path toward healing for all of them, or the final destruction of any hope for his redemption. Annelle's apartment in Portland's Pearl District was a testament to her new independent life, modern, minimalist, and deliberately free of any reminders of her past with Maverick. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Willamette River, and the space was decorated in calming neutrals with splashes of green from carefully tended plants. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly unlike the warm, lived-in home they'd planned to build together. Maverick carried Scarlett's suitcase while she held Alexander, moving slowly up the single flight of stairs to Annelle's second-floor unit. The new mother was still weak, her face pale with exhaustion from the travel, but she'd insisted on carrying her son herself. The guest room is through here, Annelle said, leading them down a hallway lined with photographs of her recent projects, wind farms and solar installations, bridges designed to accommodate wildlife migration patterns. Her professional success was evident in every frame, and Maverick felt a complicated mix of pride and loss, seeing how well she'd thrived without him. The guest room was spacious and bright, with a queen bed covered in soft white linens and a reading chair by the window. Annelle had clearly prepared for their arrival. There was a bassinet positioned near the bed, a changing station set up on the dresser, and a comfortable rocking chair in the corner. "This is perfect," Scarlett said softly, settling into the rocking chair with visible relief. "Thank you, Annelle. I know this must be difficult for you." "We'll make it work," Annelle replied simply, though Maverick caught the tension in her shoulders. "There's a bathroom right across the hall, and I've stocked the kitchen with everything you'll need for Alexander. The pediatrician I called can see him tomorrow for his first checkup." Maverick watched as she methodically went through practical details: feeding schedules, emergency numbers, the location of a 24-hour pharmacy. She was treating the situation like a project to be managed, keeping her emotions carefully controlled and professional. "Where should I stay?" Maverick asked. He'd booked a suite at the Nines Hotel downtown, but something about the domestic scene made him reluctant to leave. "Your hotel is probably more comfortable," Annelle said without looking at him. "This isn't exactly set up for 3 adults and a baby." "Actually," Scarlett interjected, shifting Alexander to her other arm, "would it be possible for Maverick to stay here too? At least for tonight? I'm still nervous about being alone with Alexander, and if something happens during the night." Annelle's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment. The couch pulls out to a bed, if you think it's necessary." Maverick could see the internal struggle playing across her features. Having him stay overnight would be a level of intimacy she clearly wasn't prepared for, but she couldn't bring herself to refuse a new mother's request for support. "It's just for tonight," he said quickly, "until you're more confident on your own." The rest of the afternoon passed in careful choreography. Annelle worked at her dining table, laptop open to engineering schematics, while Scarlett napped and Maverick paced the living room with Alexander. They moved around each other with polite distance, like strangers sharing a waiting room. When evening came, they sat down to dinner, takeout from a Thai restaurant that Annelle ordered with practiced efficiency. The conversation was stilted, focused on safe topics like Portland's weather and Alexander's feeding schedule. "This pad Thai is amazing," Scarlett said, making an effort to break the tension. "Is this place a regular for you?" "I don't cook much anymore," Annelle admitted. "When you're only feeding yourself, it seems easier to order in." The comment hung in the air, a subtle reminder of how her life had changed since their breakup. Maverick remembered how much she'd loved cooking for them both, how Sunday mornings had often started with elaborate brunches that took hours to prepare and consume. "You used to make the most incredible lemon ricotta pancakes," he said without thinking, then immediately regretted the personal reference. Annelle's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "That was a different life," she said coolly. After dinner, they established an awkward routine. Scarlett retreated to the guest room with Alexander, exhausted from her first full day out of the hospital. Annelle set up the pull-out couch for Maverick, providing him with sheets and pillows with the same efficient kindness she'd shown all day. "Thank you," he said, as she prepared to go to her own room, "for all of this. I know it can't be easy." She paused in the doorway, her hand on the light switch. In the soft lamplight, she looked younger, more like the woman he'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. "It's not about easy or difficult, Maverick. It's about doing the right thing. That little boy deserves stability and care regardless of how the adults in his life have complicated things." "And what about what you deserve?" he asked softly. "You deserve happiness, Annelle. You deserve someone who won't betray your trust." Something painful flashed across her face. "What I deserve is to stop having conversations like this. Good night, Maverick." She turned off the light and disappeared into her bedroom, leaving him alone in the living room with the pull-out couch and the weight of his regrets. Through the thin walls, he could hear Alexander stirring in the guest room, making soft sounds that would soon escalate to cries. Before Scarlett could fully wake, Maverick moved quietly down the hall and gently lifted his son from the bassinet. Alexander's tiny face scrunched in preparation for a wail, but Maverick began to rock him gently, humming an old song his own father had sung to him decades ago. To his surprise, Alexander settled against his chest, his breathing evening out as he found comfort in his father's arms. For the first time since that catastrophic night 8 months ago, Maverick felt a glimmer of peace. Maybe he didn't know how to fix the damage he'd caused between him and Annelle, but he could learn to be the father Alexander needed. What he didn't see was Annelle standing in her bedroom doorway, watching through the crack as he comforted his son in the darkened hallway. Her hand was pressed to her chest over a heart that was betraying her careful resolve by breaking just a little bit more. 2 weeks into their unconventional arrangement, a routine had emerged in Annelle's apartment. Mornings belonged to quiet efficiency, coffee brewing while Alexander had his first feeding, Scarlett growing stronger each day, Maverick dividing his time between business calls and learning to change diapers with surprising competence. Annelle maintained her professional distance, but Maverick caught glimpses of her watching him with Alexander, something unguarded flickering in her eyes before she looked away. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything shifted. Annelle was reviewing structural calculations at her laptop, Scarlett was napping, and Maverick was feeding Alexander a bottle while pacing the living room when the building's intercom buzzed through the apartment. "I'm not expecting anyone," Annelle said, frowning as she moved to the speaker by the door. "Yes?" Annelle Durand. The voice was crisp, professionally polished, distinctly male. "This is Christopher Blake. I'm here about the Cascade project." Maverick saw Annelle's face go completely white. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door release, then stopped. "Christopher Blake," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Who's Christopher Blake?" Maverick asked. But the expression on Annelle's face told him this wasn't just about business. The intercom buzzed again. "Annelle? I know this is unexpected, but I flew in from Seattle specifically to see you. We need to discuss the partnership offer." Annelle closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before pressing the button to release the building's front door. "Come up. Second floor, apartment 2B. "Annelle," Maverick said, a knot forming in his stomach. "Who is he?" She turned to face him, and he saw a complex mixture of emotions in her expression. Surprise, apprehension, and something that looked almost like guilt. Christopher is a renewable energy developer. We've been working together on a major hydroelectric project for the past 3 months. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Very supportive of my career transition. The way she said it, the careful neutrality of her tone, told Maverick everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a business relationship. 3 sharp knocks at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Annelle smoothed her hair, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and opened the door. Christopher Blake was exactly the kind of man Maverick would have hated on sight even under normal circumstances. Tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of effortless style that suggested both money and confidence. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit was clearly bespoke, and when he smiled at Annelle, it was with the familiarity of someone who had earned the right to such warmth. "Annelle," Christopher said, stepping into the apartment with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in any environment. "You look beautiful, as always." He leaned in to kiss her cheek, and Maverick felt his jaw clench involuntarily. Alexander stirred in his arms, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "Christopher, this is complicated timing," Annelle said, glancing nervously toward Maverick. "I have house guests at the moment." Christopher's gaze moved to Maverick, taking in the baby in his arms with polite curiosity. "I hope I'm not intruding. I tried calling, but your phone went straight to voicemail." "No, it's—" Annelle struggled for words, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected visit. "Christopher Blake, this is Maverick Keene." "Maverick, Christopher is the lead developer on the Cascade River project." Maverick shifted Alexander to one arm and extended his hand, noting how Christopher's grip was firm and assessing. "Mr. Blake." "Keene," Christopher repeated, recognition dawning in his dark eyes. "Keene Energy Solutions. I followed your work in renewable technology. Impressive portfolio." "Thank you," Maverick replied coolly. Christopher's gaze moved between Maverick and the baby, clearly trying to piece together the situation. "And this little one? That's Alexander," Annelle said quietly. "Maverick's son." "Ah." Christopher's smile became more polite, more distant. "Congratulations. How old?" 2 weeks, Maverick answered, his protective instincts kicking in as he studied this man who was clearly important to Annelle. The guest room door opened and Scarlett emerged, moving slowly but looking much healthier than when they'd arrived. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore one of the comfortable dresses Annelle had bought for her recovery. "I thought I heard voices," Scarlett said, then stopped short when she saw the stranger in the living room. Christopher's expression shifted again. taking in this new player in what was clearly a more complex situation than he'd anticipated. "I'm sorry. I don't think we've been introduced. Christopher Blake." "Scarlett Morrison," she replied, moving to take Alexander from Maverick's arms with the natural ease of new motherhood. Alexander's mother. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions. Christopher looked from Annelle to Maverick to Scarlett, clearly trying to understand the family dynamics at play. "Perhaps I should come back another time," he said finally, his professional composure intact but his confusion evident. "No," Annelle said quickly. "No, it's fine. We can talk. Maybe we could go to the coffee shop downstairs. Give these two some privacy with Alexander." Maverick felt a surge of something he didn't want to acknowledge. Jealousy, possessiveness, fear. The idea of Annelle leaving with this polished, successful man who clearly cared about her was almost unbearable. "Actually," Christopher said, his gaze settling on Annelle with unmistakable warmth, "I was hoping we could discuss something more personal than the Cascade project. Something I've been wanting to ask you for weeks now." Annelle's breath caught audibly. "Christopher, I know the timing might seem sudden, but the partnership offer isn't just professional, Annelle. Blake Development is looking for a permanent lead engineer, but more than that, I'm looking for—" He paused, seeming to remember their audience. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately?" Maverick felt the bottom drop out of his world. A partnership offer, a permanent position, and clearly something more personal that Christopher wanted to discuss. All the progress he thought he'd been making, all the small moments when he'd caught Annelle watching him with softness in her eyes, suddenly felt meaningless. "Yes," Annelle said, her voice strained. "Let's go downstairs." As she gathered her purse and jacket, she avoided looking directly at Maverick, but he saw the conflict in her movements, the way her hands shook slightly as she reached for her keys. "We'll be back in an hour," she said to the room in general. After they left, Scarlett settled into the rocking chair with Alexander, studying Maverick's face with surprising perceptiveness. "That was the man she's been seeing," she said finally. "She never said she was seeing anyone," Maverick replied, his voice tight. "She doesn't have to say it. It's in the way he looked at her, the way she got flustered when he showed up. And did you see that bracelet she's wearing? The silver one with the small diamond? That's not something a woman buys for herself." Maverick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Annelle was moving on, building a new life with someone who could offer her everything he'd destroyed. Trust, stability, a future without the constant reminder of betrayal. "What are you going to do?" Scarlett asked quietly. "Nothing," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm going to do nothing because I have no right to interfere in her happiness." But as he stared out the window at the Portland skyline, Maverick knew that watching Annelle leave with another man might be the final blow that destroyed whatever hope he'd been secretly harboring for their redemption. Annelle returned to the apartment 90 minutes later, her face flushed and her movements agitated. She closed the door more firmly than necessary and leaned against it for a moment as if gathering her strength. Maverick looked up from where he sat on the couch, Alexander sleeping peacefully in his arms, and immediately knew something significant had happened. "How did it go?" Scarlett asked gently from the kitchen where she was preparing a bottle for Alexander's next feeding. "It was—" Annelle paused, struggling for words. "Complicated." She moved to the window, staring out at the city as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room. Her fingers twisted the silver bracelet Scarlett had noticed, and Maverick found himself studying her profile, trying to read the emotions playing across her features. "Christopher offered me a partnership," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Not just in the Cascade project, but in his entire development company. It would mean relocating to Seattle, overseeing renewable energy projects across the Pacific Northwest. It's everything I've worked toward professionally." "That's incredible," Scarlett said, genuine enthusiasm in her voice. "Congratulations." But Maverick could see the tension in Annelle's shoulders, the way she held herself like someone bracing for impact. "There's more, isn't there?" Annelle turned from the window, and for the first time since Christopher's arrival, she looked directly at Maverick. He also proposed. The words hit Maverick like a physical blow. Alexander stirred in his arms, sensing the sudden change in his father's breathing, and Maverick forced himself to remain calm for his son's sake. "Proposed?" Scarlett repeated, her voice rising slightly in surprise. "Marriage," Annelle clarified, her gaze never leaving Maverick's face. "He's been planning it for weeks. Had the ring custom designed, researched my favorite restaurants, even spoke to my parents about his intentions." Maverick felt something inside his chest crack. Christopher had done everything right. Everything Maverick himself had done 3 years ago when he'd proposed to Annelle on a beach in Santorini. The other man had been patient, respectful, thorough, all the things Maverick had failed to be when it mattered most. What did you tell him? The question escaped before Maverick could stop it, though his voice was steady. I told him I needed time to think. Annelle's hands were shaking now, and she clasped them together to still the tremor. He was understanding about it. Said he'd wait as long as I needed, but that he hoped I'd consider relocating to Seattle regardless of my answer about marriage. But you're considering it, Scarlett observed quietly. Both the partnership and the proposal. I should be, Annelle said, her voice thick with emotion. Christopher is a good man. He's successful, kind, patient. He's never lied to me or betrayed my trust. He wants the same things I want professionally and personally. On paper, he's perfect. On paper, Maverick repeated, latching onto the qualifier. Annelle's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. But I can't say yes to him while I'm standing in an apartment with you and your son, pretending that the past 2 weeks haven't changed everything I thought I knew about what I wanted. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. Scarlett quietly excused herself to the guest room, taking Alexander with her and leaving them alone for the first time since that night in the hospital. Annelle, Maverick began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Do you know what the hardest part has been? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. It's not watching you with Scarlett, because I can see that whatever you two shared was never love. It's watching you with Alexander, seeing you become the father I always knew you could be, seeing you put his needs before your own comfort and convenience. Maverick stood slowly, moving closer but careful not to invade her space. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've spent 2 weeks watching you learn to love your son, and it's reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place. Your capacity for growth, for becoming better than you were. But it's also shown me how much I want that. A family, children, someone who chooses me every day instead of making one catastrophic mistake that ruins everything. I did choose you, Maverick said desperately. Every day for 3 years, I chose you. One night of weakness doesn't erase that, but it does erase the trust, she said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. And without trust, what do we have? Hope that you won't hurt me again? Faith that next time you're drunk and feeling neglected, you'll make better choices? You think I felt neglected? The question surprised him. Annelle wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Scarlett told me what you said that night, about feeling like you were losing me to my career, about worrying that I didn't appreciate what we had. Was that true? Maverick sank back onto the couch, the weight of his honesty almost unbearable. You were working 16-hour days on the Portland project proposal. We hadn't had dinner together in 3 weeks. I was proud of your ambition, but I missed you. I missed us. So instead of talking to me about it, you talked to her, and let her convince you that the solution was in a bottle of champagne and a hotel room. No, he said firmly. I let my own insecurities and poor judgment convince me. Scarlett didn't force me to do anything. She just offered what I was too weak to refuse in that moment. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared pain filling the space between them. Outside, Portland's evening traffic hummed past, life continuing its normal rhythm while their world hung in balance. Christopher wants an answer within the week, Annelle said finally. He's extending a job offer to another engineer if I decline, and he needs to know about the partnership to finalize his company's 5-year plan. A week, Maverick repeated. I need to know something, Maverick. If Alexander hadn't been born, if Scarlett had miscarried or chosen adoption, would you have tried to win me back? Or was losing me just the price you accepted for that one night? The question cut to the heart of everything he'd been wrestling with for 8 months. I tried to respect your decision to leave. I thought pursuing you would be selfish after what I'd done. That's not what I asked. He met her eyes, knowing that his answer might determine both their futures. I never stopped hoping. Every day I hoped you'd call or show up at my office or give me some sign that forgiveness was possible. But I also knew I had no right to that hope. And now, with Alexander in the picture, with Scarlett recovering in my guest room with a life that's infinitely more complicated than it was 8 months ago, what are you hoping for now? Before he could answer, the guest room door opened and Scarlett appeared, her face pale and stricken. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Alexander's running a fever and he won't stop crying. I think something's wrong. The pediatric emergency room at Oregon Health and Science University was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Alexander's fever had spiked to 103.2 degrees during the frantic taxi ride to the hospital, and his tiny body felt like fire in Maverick's arms. Scarlett sat beside him in the waiting room, tears streaming down her face as she blamed herself for not recognizing the signs sooner. "It's not your fault," Annelle said firmly, returning from the registration desk with a clipboard of forms. "Newborn fevers can spike quickly. You did everything right by recognizing something was wrong. But I'm his mother," Scarlett said brokenly. "I should have known. I should have seen the signs earlier." Maverick looked up from where he'd been staring at the floor, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of helplessness. "We're all learning," he said quietly. "None of us knew what to expect." Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatric emergency physician, emerged from the treatment room with a reassuring expression. "Mr. Keene, Alexander is stable. His fever is responding to medication, and we've run some preliminary tests. It appears to be a common bacterial infection that newborns sometimes develop, completely treatable with antibiotics." The collective exhale of relief from all three adults was audible. Maverick felt his legs nearly give out from the sudden release of tension. "Can we see him?" Scarlett asked, standing on unsteady feet. "Of course. He's sleeping comfortably now, but you can sit with him while we wait for the final blood work results." As they made their way to Alexander's room, Maverick found himself walking between Annelle and Scarlett, the three of them united by concern for the tiny life that had brought them together in such an unlikely way. The crisis had stripped away all pretense and careful distance. They were simply three people who loved a baby and had been terrified of losing him. Alexander lay in a pediatric crib, looking impossibly small against the white hospital sheets. His fever had broken and his breathing was steady and peaceful. An IV line delivered antibiotics through his tiny hand, but his color was already improving. "He looks so much better," Annelle whispered, reaching out to gently stroke his dark hair. "Thank God," Scarlett said, sinking into the chair beside his crib. "I've never been so scared in my life." Maverick watched Annelle with his son and felt something shift in his chest. The way she touched Alexander wasn't just kind or caring. It was maternal. She looked at his son the way a mother would, with protective love and instinctive tenderness. "Annelle," he said quietly, "can I talk to you outside for a moment?" She nodded, following him into the hallway where other families waited for news about their own children. They found a quiet alcove with plastic chairs and a view of the Portland skyline through tall windows. "You love him," Maverick said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she admitted without hesitation. "I didn't expect to, but I do. These past 2 weeks, watching him grow and change, seeing his personality emerge, I can't help but love him." "And Scarlett?" Annelle was quiet for a moment, considering. "She's not who I expected her to be. I thought I'd hate her, but she's just young and scared and trying to do her best. She made a terrible choice that night, but she's paying for it every day. And she clearly loves Alexander more than anything." "What about Christopher's offer?" The question had been burning in Maverick's mind since they'd rushed to the hospital. "When I got that call from Scarlett saying Alexander was sick, when I heard the panic in her voice." Annelle's voice broke slightly. "All I could think was that we needed to get to the hospital. Not you and Scarlett, not Alexander's parents. Like we were a family." Maverick's heart pounded against his ribs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that sitting in this waiting room terrified that something might happen to Alexander, I realized that somewhere along the way he became mine too. Not legally, not biologically, but emotionally. And the thought of moving to Seattle, of building a life with Christopher while Alexander grows up 3 states away." She shook her head. "I can't do it." "You're turning down the proposal?" "I'm turning down everything," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "The partnership, the marriage, the chance to start fresh somewhere else. Because as much as I want to protect myself from more heartbreak, I can't walk away from that little boy. And I can't walk away from you." Maverick felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Annelle, I'm not saying I forgive you," she said quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm not saying we can go back to what we had before. But tonight, watching you with Alexander when he was sick, seeing how you put his needs before your fear, I remembered why I fell in love with you, and I realized that if I run away now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible if I'd been brave enough to try again." Before Maverick could respond, Scarlett appeared in the hallway, her face bright with relief. "The doctor says we can take him home tomorrow morning," she said. "The antibiotics are working perfectly and his fever is completely gone. That's wonderful, Anel said, her voice thick with emotion. There's something else, Scarlett continued, her expression growing serious. Something I need to tell both of you. I've been thinking about this for days, but tonight, sitting there watching Alexander sleep, I realized I can't put it off any longer. Maverick felt his stomach clench with new anxiety. What is it? I've been offered a job, Scarlett said. My college roommate lives in Denver now and she's starting a marketing firm. She wants me to be her partner. It's a fresh start, away from all the complications here. What about Alexander? Anel asked, though her voice was carefully neutral. Scarlett's eyes filled with tears. That's what I need to discuss with you both. I love my son more than life itself, but I also know that I'm 26 years old, financially dependent on Maverick's generosity, and emotionally unprepared for single motherhood. These past 2 weeks, watching you two with Alexander, you're both naturals at this. You love him the way he deserves to be loved. Scarlett, Maverick began, but she held up a hand. I'm not talking about abandoning him, she said quickly. I'm talking about shared custody, about giving him the stability of two parents who choose each other every day instead of one mother who's still figuring out how to choose herself. As they stood in that hospital hallway, with Alexander sleeping peacefully just a few feet away, Maverick realized that everything was about to change again. But this time, the change felt like possibility rather than catastrophe. 6 months later, Maverick stood in the doorway of the nursery he'd carefully designed in his Manhattan penthouse, watching Anel rock Alexander to sleep. The room was painted in soft greens and blues, with hand-carved wooden furniture and a mural of a forest that seemed to grow up the walls toward a star-filled ceiling. It was nothing like the sterile, expensive nursery he'd originally planned. It was warm, lived in, full of love. He's getting so big, Anel murmured, adjusting the blanket around Alexander's sleeping form. At 8 months old, he was sitting up on his own, babbling constantly, and had developed an infectious laugh that could light up any room. Scarlett will be here in an hour, Maverick said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. Are you nervous about telling her? Anel's left hand caught the lamplight as she smoothed Alexander's hair, the engagement ring Maverick had given her 3 weeks ago sparkling against her finger. It wasn't the same ring from before. They'd chosen this one together, a symbol of their second chance rather than their original promise. A little, she admitted. Even though she suggested the arrangement herself, actually signing the custody papers feels so final. The past 6 months had been a careful dance of healing and rebuilding. Scarlett had taken the job in Denver, visiting Alexander twice a month and calling every few days to check on his development. She'd thrown herself into her new career with impressive determination, building something of her own while gradually finding peace with her decision to share custody. She's happy, Maverick said, thinking of their last video call when Scarlett had introduced them to her new boyfriend, a kind-eyed architect who made her laugh in ways Maverick had never managed. Really happy. The guilt she was carrying about that night, about how Alexander was conceived, letting go of it has freed her to become who she's meant to be. And what about us? Anel asked, turning to face him. Are we who we're meant to be? It was the question that had haunted both of them through months of couples therapy, family counseling sessions, and long conversations about trust and forgiveness. Dr. Martinez had warned them that rebuilding their relationship wouldn't be simple, that they'd essentially have to fall in love with new versions of themselves, people shaped by pain and growth and hard-won wisdom. I know who you are, Maverick said, reaching for her free hand. You're the woman who chose love over safety, who opened her heart to a child that wasn't biologically yours, who taught me that being a good father means putting family before everything else. You're stronger than you were before, and somehow that makes me love you even more. And you, she said, intertwining their fingers. You're the man who learned that success isn't just about building an empire, but about building a home. You chose to fight for us instead of just accepting that you'd lost everything. You became the father Alexander needed, and the partner I needed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Alexander sleep. The baby's peaceful breathing was the soundtrack to their new life, quieter than before, more intentional, built on a foundation of hard truths rather than easy assumptions. I have something to tell you, Anel said suddenly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Good news or challenging news? Maverick asked, though her expression suggested he already knew. Potentially life-changing news. She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. We're going to need a bigger nursery. The words hit Maverick like a bolt of lightning. Are you? 8 weeks? she confirmed, her smile breaking into a full grin. I wanted to wait until after we signed the custody papers with Scarlett, until everything was settled with Alexander. Maverick pulled her into his arms, careful not to wake the baby sleeping in her lap. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. Are you happy? She asked, though his expression already answered the question. Terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond words, he said. When? February. Alexander will be about 14 months old when his little brother or sister arrives. The future stretched out before them like a gift they'd never expected to receive. Not the perfect life they'd originally planned, but something deeper and more meaningful. A family built from forgiveness, strengthened by adversity, and grounded in the kind of love that could survive anything. When Scarlett arrived an hour later, she took one look at their faces and immediately knew something had changed. You're glowing, she said to Annelle, then gasped as realization dawned. Oh my God, are you pregnant? We just found out for certain yesterday, Annelle said, beaming. Scarlett's reaction surprised them both. Instead of jealousy or awkwardness, her face lit up with genuine joy. Alexander's going to be a big brother. That's incredible. As they sat around the living room, signing custody papers that would give Maverick and Annelle primary physical custody, while ensuring Scarlett remained an important part of Alexander's life, Maverick marveled at how far they'd all come. Scarlett was building a new life in Denver, confident and independent. Annelle had found a way to forgive without forgetting, to love without naivety, and he'd learned that being a man worthy of their trust meant making different choices every single day. There's something else, Scarlett said, as they finished with the legal documents. David, my boyfriend, he's asked me to move in with him. Nothing dramatic, just the next step. That's wonderful, Annelle said warmly. You deserve happiness, Scarlett. Real happiness. So do you, Scarlett replied, looking between Maverick and Annelle. Both of you. What happened that night was my fault as much as his, and I'm grateful every day that something beautiful came from something so ugly. Later that evening, after Scarlett had returned to her hotel and Alexander was sleeping peacefully in his crib, Maverick and Annelle stood on the terrace of his penthouse, looking out over the city lights. No regrets? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. About which part? Forgiving you? Staying in New York? Agreeing to marry you again? Any of it. All of it. Annelle leaned back against his chest, her hands covering his where they rested on her stomach. Ask me again in 20 years, when we're watching Alexander graduate from college and trying to keep up with a teenager who has your stubborn streak and my engineering brain. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd survived together. I love you too, she replied. All of you. The man who made mistakes, the man who learned from them, and the man who chose to fight for our family even when it seemed impossible. As they stood together under the Manhattan stars, with their sleeping son just a few rooms away and their unborn child growing safely inside Annelle's body, Maverick knew that this was what redemption looked like. Not perfection, but the courage to keep choosing love, even after betrayal. Not the absence of scars, but the strength to let those scars tell a story of healing rather than hurt. Their love story hadn't ended with betrayal and heartbreak. It had simply been rewritten, stronger and more beautiful than either of them had dared to hope. 5 years later, the sprawling backyard of their Westchester home was alive with the chaos of a 5-year-old's birthday party. Alexander, now a confident kindergartner with his father's dark hair and his mother's curious hazel eyes, raced across the perfectly manicured lawn with a pack of his classmates, his laughter echoing off the trees that Annelle had personally selected and planted when they'd moved from the Manhattan penthouse 3 years ago. Maverick stood at the outdoor kitchen, manning the grill while keeping one eye on his son and another on 3-year-old Emma, who had inherited her mother's engineering mind and was currently constructing an elaborate castle in the sandbox with mathematical precision. Her golden curls caught the afternoon sunlight as she explained to her younger brother, 2-year-old James, why his block placement was structurally unsound. The foundation needs to be wider than the top, Emma was saying with the serious tone of a professor addressing a particularly slow student. Otherwise, gravity will make it fall down. James, who had Maverick's gray eyes and Annelle's infectious smile, simply grinned and knocked over his sister's careful construction, sending blocks flying in all directions. Daddy, Emma wailed, her architectural masterpiece in ruins. James Keene, Maverick called out with mock sternness. What's the rule about destroying your sister's projects? Say sorry and help fix it, James recited dutifully, though he was clearly fighting back giggles. Annelle emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade, her summer dress flowing around her legs as she navigated between excited children. At 35, she'd grown into her role as mother and wife, with a grace that still took Maverick's breath away. The soft lines around her eyes spoke of years of laughter, and the confidence in her movements reflected the success of her consulting firm, which had grown from a one-woman operation to a team of 12 engineers specializing in sustainable family housing. "Alexander, honey, come wash your hands," she called to their eldest. "Aunt Scarlett will be here any minute with your surprise." Alexander's face lit up at the mention of Scarlett, who had become a beloved fixture in their unconventional family. Her visits had increased over the years as her Denver-based marketing firm expanded, and she'd recently opened a New York office that allowed her to spend 2 weekends a month with them. "Is Uncle David coming too?" Alexander asked, racing over to the outdoor sink they'd installed specifically for muddy children. "Of course he is," Annelle said, ruffling his hair. "He wouldn't miss your birthday." Scarlett's marriage to David Morrison 18 months ago had been a small, intimate affair in the mountains outside Denver. Alexander had served as ring bearer, his chest puffed with pride as he carried the rings down the aisle. The wedding photos now held a place of honor on their living room mantelpiece, next to pictures of Maverick and Annelle's own second wedding, and countless family moments that documented their blended family's growth. 37 kids, Maverick said as Annelle approached the grill. "Did we really invite 37 5-year-olds to our house?" 35 kids and 2 very tired adults who clearly didn't think this through, Annelle corrected, standing on her toes to kiss his cheek. "But look at him, Maverick, look how happy he is." Maverick followed her gaze to Alexander, who was now organizing his classmates into teams for some elaborate game that involved strategic placement of pool noodles and appeared to require a great deal of shouting. Their son was confident, kind, and naturally inclusive, the kind of child who noticed when someone was sitting alone and immediately invited them to join whatever adventure he was orchestrating. "He's incredible," Maverick said softly. "They all are. Even when James is systematically destroying everything Emma builds?" "Especially then," Maverick replied, watching his youngest son toddle after his sister with determined affection. "He's going to keep her from taking herself too seriously, and she's going to teach him that there are consequences for his actions," Annelle added. "Perfect balance." The sound of a car in the driveway announced Scarlett and David's arrival, and Alexander abandoned his pool noodle strategy to race toward the gate. Scarlett emerged from a silver SUV looking radiant in a flowing blue dress, her auburn hair shorter now and streaked with highlights that caught the afternoon sun. David followed, carrying what appeared to be a large, mysteriously wrapped box that had Alexander practically vibrating with excitement. "Aunt Scarlett," Alexander launched himself into her arms with the enthusiasm of a child who had never questioned the love of every adult in his expanded family. "Happy birthday, sweet boy," Scarlett said, spinning him around before setting him down. "Are you ready for your surprise?" "What is it? What is it?" Alexander bounced on his toes while his siblings and their party guests gathered around. "Well," David said, setting down the large box with a theatrical grunt, "your Aunt Scarlett and I have some news to share, and we thought your birthday party would be the perfect time." Maverick and Annelle exchanged glances, recognizing the particular glow on Scarlett's face and the protective way David's hand rested on her back. "We're going to have a baby," Scarlett announced, her voice bright with joy. "Which means you're going to be a cousin, Alexander." The cheer that went up from the assembled adults was nearly drowned out by Alexander's whoop of excitement. "A cousin! Did you hear that, Emma? James? We're getting a cousin." As congratulations and hugs were exchanged, Maverick found himself standing slightly apart from the celebration, watching his extraordinary family with wonder. 6 years ago, he'd been a man who had everything and threw it away in one night of poor judgment. Today, he was surrounded by more love than he'd ever thought possible. Scarlett caught his eye across the crowd and made her way over, leaving David to field questions about due dates and baby names. "Can you believe this is our life?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch steps. 6 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be married to an amazing man, running a successful business, and announcing my pregnancy at my biological son's birthday party, while his stepmother, who used to be my lover's fiancée, organizes games for our extended family, I'd have thought they were insane. "It sounds like a soap opera when you put it like that," Maverick said with a laugh. "The best kind," Scarlett replied. "The kind where everyone gets their happy ending even when they don't deserve it." You deserved happiness, Scarlett, you always did. So did you, and so did Annelle. She watched as Annelle helped Emma construct a new, even more elaborate castle, while James supervised by providing running commentary. She's an incredible mother. She's an incredible everything, Maverick said. I still don't know what I did to deserve a second chance with her. You fought for it, Scarlett said simply. Every day for months you chose to be better than you were. That's not luck, Maverick, that's character. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the party wound down, Maverick found himself in Alexander's bedroom, reading his son's favorite bedtime story, a tale about a dragon who learned to use his fire to help others instead of causing destruction. It had become their nightly ritual, this story about transformation and second chances. Daddy, Alexander said as Maverick closed the book, when the new baby comes, will you and Uncle David teach them to play soccer like you taught me? If they want to learn, Maverick said, tucking the covers around his son's shoulders. But they might want to learn engineering like Mommy and Emma, or art like Aunt Scarlett, or building like Uncle David. Or they might want to learn everything like me, Alexander said with the supreme confidence of a 5-year-old who believed the world was full of infinite possibilities. You're right, Maverick said, kissing his son's forehead. They might want to learn everything. Later, as Maverick and Annelle cleaned up the remnants of the party while their younger children slept, they found themselves once again standing together under the stars. The Westchester sky was clearer than Manhattan's had been, and they could actually see constellations from their back porch. Tired? Maverick asked, wrapping his arms around Annelle from behind. Exhausted, she admitted, leaning back against his chest. But happy. So incredibly happy. Any regrets about this crazy life we've built? Annelle was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had become their tradition, asked and answered on birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings when the children were still sleeping. Do you know what I realized today? She said finally, watching Alexander with all his friends, seeing how naturally he includes everyone, how he's learned to love unconditionally. He's going to grow up thinking that families come in all different shapes, that love is something you choose rather than something that just happens to you. And that's a good thing? That's the most important thing, she said, turning in his arms to face him. He'll never take love for granted the way we did in the beginning. He'll understand that it requires work and forgiveness and the courage to keep choosing each other even when it's hard. So no regrets? Only one, she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. I regret that it took us 6 years to realize we should have been throwing birthday parties this elaborate all along. Alexander is already asking if next year's party can include a petting zoo. Maverick laughed, the sound carrying across their peaceful backyard to where their children slept safely in their beds. A petting zoo it is then. Anything for our boy. Our boys, Annelle corrected, looking toward the house where James was likely already dreaming. And our little Emma too, of course. 3 children, Maverick said wonderingly. Alexander, Emma, and James. We're going to need a bigger car when they're all teenagers. We're going to need a lot of things, Annelle said. Patience, energy, probably a vacation when they're all teenagers. But not more love, Maverick said, understanding flooding through him. We seem to have an endless supply of that. As they stood together under the star-filled sky, surrounded by the evidence of their beautifully complicated life, Maverick knew that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the transformation of those scars into something beautiful. Not the perfect family they'd once planned, but the perfect family for them, built on forgiveness, strengthened by adversity, and held together by the kind of love that could survive anything. Their story hadn't ended with betrayal and heartbreak. It had simply been rewritten one day at a time, one choice at a time, until it became something neither of them could have imagined, but both of them knew they couldn't live without. In the end, that was the greatest gift their mistakes had given them. The knowledge that love wasn't something that happened to them, but something they created together every single day, with every choice to forgive, to trust, and to keep building something beautiful from the pieces of what had been broken. What would you do if given a second chance at love? Would you have the courage to rebuild trust from the ashes of betrayal? Or would fear keep you from the happiness that might be possible on the other side of forgiveness? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.